Welcome to 20th Century Music and Arts. In this episode, we're going to look at the history of the band Pere, and in fact, we're going to dive deeper into the whole proto-punk scene that happened in Cleveland. Now, when discussing the evolution of various music scenes that gave birth to what we now know as punk rock, cities such as New York, Detroit, and London are obvious reference points. However, one city that often gets overlooked is Cleveland. In the early to mid-1970s, Cleveland developed a unique underground music scene that was very different from the scenes happening in those other cities. This scene would ultimately produce one of the most unique and innovative bands in alternative rock history, and would also see the tragic downfall of a really unknown singer-songwriter. Now, this is the story of Pere and proto-punk Cleveland. In the 1970s, Cleveland was a tough industrial city that had a polluted river that would occasionally catch on fire, and also had quite a bit of mob violence. But within this gritty landscape, a very unique music scene would develop. Now, a band that had a huge influence on the scene would be the Velvet Underground. They would actually tour Cleveland, and they would play places like La Cave in the late 1960s. One person who would attend these shows was a teenager named Peter Laughner. Now, Laughner was a fan of old blues and British Invasion, but it really was the music of the Velvet Underground and also Captain Beefheart that inspired him. He would watch intensely the chords that Lou Reed would play and during the live concerts he attended, and he started to bring these influences to his old high school band called Mr. Charlie. Laughner was also into a lot of different other music, a lot of experimental music, free jazz like Albert Ayler and modern composers like John Cage, and he was also quite a voracious reader. He really liked French symbolists like Charles Baudelaire. His band broke up after high school, but Laughner continued to be involved in the music scene, and in 1970 he went to California to kind of make it as a singer-songwriter. When he returned to Cleveland, his friend Jamie Kimmick had formed his own Velvet Underground-inspired band called The Mirrors. Now, they played original material, along with covers of Syd Barrett-era Pink Floyd, The Troggs, and of course, Velvet Underground songs. In fact, the band brought their very own version of pop melody to the feedback-laden Velvet sound, and the sound of The Mirrors is also very, very psychedelic too. They only ended up putting out one single in the mid-70s before they broke up.
There was a time when she was young. She was young all of the time.
Laughner wanted to start his own band, and he created one called Cinderella Backstreet. Now, even though Peter had written his own songs, he did not feel confident in the material, so the band kind of played a lot of covers. The band played their final gig in August of 1973, and there have been numerous members of the band, including Chrissie Hynde, yes, that Chrissie Hynde of the Pretenders. Laughner was also writing about rock and roll, and he soon befriended the famous rock journalist Lester Bangs. They shared the love for the Velvets, the Stooges, and the New York Dolls. But there was another underground band emerging out of Cleveland, the Electric Eels. Now, this band truly came out of left field. John Morton, Brian McMahon, and Dave E. McManus all attended a Captain Beefheart concert in 1972. Now, they really did not think the opening band was very good, and they thought they could do better. Now, the members, not all of them did necessarily have great musical chops. Some of them did, but some of them didn't. And playing stuff like Captain Beefheart's Magic Band could be technically difficult, but they knew they could be noisy and avant-garde. So they're being inspired by the free jazz of Albert Ayler, Ornette Coleman, and Sun Ra, and again, stuff like John Cage, but they're channeling it through something more simplistic, like the proto-punk of MC5 and the Stooges. And in fact, they had this whole concept of kind of create an art terrorism. And oh boy, did they do that. Now, over the course of their career, which went from about 72 to 75, there were only 5 public concerts. And their stage shows were absolutely crazy. Now, John Morton was a massive, imposing man who actually enjoyed getting into fights with the audience and, at times, would get into fights with the band members. And singer Dave McManus would cover himself in mouse traps. Unconventional instruments were part of their sound, which include everything from McManus playing the clarinet, Morton hitting sheet metal with a sledgehammer, and one gig that got them banned, they started a gas-powered lawnmower on stage. The promoter did not like that one. Of course, this got them banned from playing gigs at that location. But they get into all kinds of other controversies. They would go to blue-collar bars and slow dance with each other so that the rednecks would attack them. They would openly wear things like swastikas on stage, not because they believed in that ideology, they were just trying to be offensive. And Morton would have his arm broken by the cops during a drunken arrest. And so he just kind of made his own cast with a slide rule and a wrench stuck next to it. Now, the band would dissolve in their own chaos in 1975. 2 singles, Agitate and Cyclotron and Spin Age, Blasters and Bunnies, would eventually be released posthumously in 78 and 81. And a compilation was released in 1991 called God Says F You. This band was self-conscious and in-your-face nihilistic punk rock that predated the Sex Pistols.
Oh, I'm so agitated, run through a washing machine, agitated. Get your baby bunnies, they are warm and friendly, watch them as they play.
Now, Laughner would eventually form his own band that would be more aligned with the Mirrors and the Electric Eels. You know, there was Cinderella Backstreet, reformed as Cinderella's Revenge, but that kind of fell apart. And then there's another band called the Finns. But he befriended a man named David Thomas. David Thomas was a very unique individual. He grew up in a Mormon household, but he had this eclectic taste in music. He liked everything from Hawkwind, The Stooges, MC5 Can, Soft Machine, Richard Thompson, Brian Eno, Roxy Music, Captain Beefheart, and Frank Zappa. Now, Laughner shared his love for a lot of that music, but he did not like the Frank Zappa, which he just didn't like the humor in it. But that absurd humor was very much a part of David Thomas's visions. They decided to put a band together called Rocket from the Tombs. Now, at first, David Thomas thought it would be a joke, and he actually created this stage name called Crocus Behemoth. But Laughner convinced him that this actually could be something quite serious. So along with these kind of eclectic sonic influences, Laughner wanted to bring the influence of the kind of melancholy folk he also liked from guys like Michael Hurley and Nick Drake. Now, after getting rid of their initial lineup, the band would eventually be Laughner on guitar, Dave Thompson on vocals, Cheetah Chrome O'Connor on guitar, Johnny Madman Medansky on drums, and Craig Bell on bass. Now, they also often shared vocals, and there was just a lot of different visions competing with this band. But one thing is true. This band was fierce in sound and noise, and it kind of extended the proto-punk of the Stooges, but it had those avant-garde elements. Now, the band would debut on December 22nd, 1974 at a place called The Viking, and they shared the bill with both the Mirrors and the Electric Eels, and the event was called Special Extermination Night. This band would actually only be in existence for a year, and like the Electric Eels, had their own nihilistic internal tensions. They wrote songs that would be the basis for some later by Pere, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, Final Solution, and Life Stinks. And there was also songs that would show up on the Dead Boys debut, What Is Love, Ain't It Fun, and Sonic Reducer. Then there were songs that highlighted Peter Laughner's singer-songwriter side, like Muckraker. And also, Ain't It Fun really shows Laughner's nihilistic lyrics. You know, they cover things like Stooges' Raw Power and even the Rolling Stones' Satisfaction, but Thomas hated doing covers, but Laughner loved them. But that was not the only issue in the band. Laughner took the excess of the rock and roll lifestyle to some sort of urban extreme, and he was notorious for mixing downers like Valium with large amounts of alcohol. This excess would be the basis for the nihilistic lyrics he would pen. But, you know, the future of the band was always in doubt. Thomas could be quite volatile on stage, and he started developing this sort of unique yelping vocal style. And again, this caused tensions in the band, and a guy by the name of Stiv Bators also joined temporarily, and he put his own vocals in as well. So the band did manage to get a bunch of demos they recorded in February 1975 on a local radio station, which, exposed them to a bigger audience. Now, Laughner was very serious about his musical vision. He wanted to create music that he thought would change the audience, the way of looking at things. He wanted to make a kind of artistic statement. He didn't want to do entertainment. Now, Morton of the Electric Eels was not really impressed with Laughner. He felt Laughner was kind of this hipster, which is why the Rockets were not invited to play at the second special extermination night. But Rockets concerts could be just as insane as anything by the Eels. In fact, in July 1975, they managed to get a gig opening up for two New York artists, Television and Patti Smith, and they played at Cleveland's Piccadilly Club. At this point, I think Wayne Strick had replaced Mendansky on drums, but before the gig, O'Connor and Bell got into a fight in the dressing room. The other two members dropped acid. O'Connor actually fell down on stage, but he kept playing without missing a beat. Now, Richard Lloyd of Television stated about the Rockets, and that's one scary group. But secretly, he wished he could be in a band like that. He would actually get his wish in 2003 when the band did reform. But there was just too much tension in the band. One side wanted to play kind of New York Dolls style rock and roll. The other side wanted to experiment, and then Peter wanted to put his own singer-songwriter thing in there as well. At their final gig, O'Connor brought his friend on stage, and Laughner and Thomas were not having it, and a fight broke out. And that was basically the end of them. In fact, by mid-1975, it was the end of all the groups. By August, the Electric Eels, the Mirrors, and the Rockets from the Tomb, they'd all broken up. The Mirrors had managed to release one single called Surely She Smiled Wild on a Heathen Records in 1975. Now, this scene in Cleveland was unique, and the bands were innovative as anything coming out of CBGBs in New York. Now, eventually the music by these bands would be released on various compilations posthumously, and they're all worth checking out. These bands, they brought a confrontational element, and they were also self-conscious in their nihilism, and this will be seen a couple of years later with Johnny Rotten and the Sex Pistols. But now in the next episode, we're going to look at how Rocket from the Tombs birthed two new bands. And we're also going to see the fate of Peter Laughner. And why don't we also look at some of the other bands that kind of emerged out of Cleveland at this time. Thank you for watching 20th Century Music and Arts. Please like, share, subscribe, and let me know. Have you heard any of this music before?